Hello everyone, I'm John Welty and welcome to Shop Talk with Mestek Machinery. In today's podcast, I'm joined by Mike Bailey and David Daw, and our discussion focuses on innovations that have been introduced in the HVAC duct and fittings fabrication industry over the last 80 years or so, many of which were introduced by Mestek Machinery and our brands, and how they've impacted the industry. Thanks again for joining us. Welcome to Shop Talk with Mestek Machinery. I'm John Welty, and I'm here with Mike Bailey and David Daw, and we're going to be talking about innovation over time and how that has been improving duct fabrication. Mike, could you kick this off?
Yeah, this is one of the neater topics, I think. The innovation that started in 1938 by the LOCKFORMER company up until 2022, basically almost every other year, every 5 years to every decade, showing what innovation that this company has been able to bring to the duct fabrication world to improve duct fabrication for the contractors themselves. David can speak to the 1938 innovation. I think he was around then, and I'll speak more like to the 2000s, and that's how this is going to work.
Thank you for dating me, Michael. Thank you here. So not quite 1938, but as I've been told, a gentleman by the name of George Lambertson, only one of two people in my 50 years in this industry I ever addressed by the Mr. I believe he and Harley Flagler at some point from Flagler Machinery or whatever the name of the company was, split off, and he formed LOCKFORMER in 1938. And within the year developed the first, I believe, Pittsburgh roll former. And that's really what it started.
Yes. Yeah, and then that evolved over to what I believe would be coil processing, which you could talk to, especially with your family history.
Not until much later, though.
It was much later, but but that's the next big step, is how we got into the coil processing with how your grandfathers, uncles, and father was involved in that. I think in the 1950s, maybe.
Yeah, I don't know exactly when they started making the duct lines. He actually started with a downspout gutter machine. Which is where Art Welty first started, because he was installing it, and he built a machine in order to make his own gutters, just to save himself labor.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And then later started selling that and put a lot of people into business, entrepreneurs, by setting them up with a truck, a coil stand and a machine that could produce gutter right out of the back of their trucks. That's where that started. Now, when it made the transition to the duct lines, I'm a little fuzzy on that myself. So,
well, during the 40s and during the war, and then into the late 40s, it was primarily, if I'm not mistaken, heating that they were concerned for. There wasn't much central air at the time, but there was some ducting of furnace. But it wasn't until air conditioning really took off after World War II that really started moving to develop this. And I believe it was again all sheet stock up through the 1950s. But it wasn't, I got in this industry in 1968, 69. I think the first coil processing machine for ductwork was about maybe 65, 66.
That'd be my guess.
Somewhere in that. And then things started to change.
And that was primarily 48-inch wide.
It was all 48. Because when I first started traveling for Gritnail in 69 and 70, most of it was 4-foot metal. Matter of fact, I was in a garage at Cedars-Sinai's Hospital.
So you're talking 4-foot wide coil.
For the length of I was in Cedars-Sinai's garage here about 2 weeks ago, and it was 4-foot duct. I mean, it was just really interesting. And so you can almost date when this building was built by that. But it was mostly 48, and the switch to 5-foot coil started around 1970, give or take.
Yeah.
And so a lot of shops started up with just handling sheets first. I mean, even today, some small shops will start off with handling sheets, because that's kind of the entry level of the equipment and the investment, the capital investment. Yeah. And then at what point does it progress? And that's where you see on when we talk about innovation over time, coil line didn't even exist prior to that point in time. But then it still became an option as a company was growing. So it was not just innovation in the industry; it was also innovation for a company. It's each of the customers. Right?
The biggest innovation was Engel Shopmaster, somewhere in the 1950s.
Okay.
Every contractor in the world had that. And now, at that point in time, Engel was a standalone company, now part of our family. But the Shopmaster was the machine prior to Coil.
And that pulled metal off of a coil.
No, it was just sheet stock.
That was sheet also.
It would notch, it would shear, but it was all sheets. It was manual.
Oh, that okay.
And I believe that was a Herb Fisher design, going back that late, maybe no?
It could have been, what was Engel first, Herb may have been involved, but Engel, and I forgot the guy's name, who started Engel, he was the one that I believe was, but it could have been Herb.
But it seems like to me the history I've been told, that's what developed into the coil line, was the Shopmaster, then the coil line.
Correct.
And the coil line in that early day was much different than what it is today, right? It didn't do any insulation.
Correct.
There wasn't pinning at the early time.
No.
Did it start as just punching and notching from a coil and stop there?
Yeah, it was just feed and stop.
So it's just
the link.
What they call a starter line today.
Yes, what they call a front end starter line today.
Okay.
And then over time that evolved. The pinning became available. Insulation became available. Then the bigger one was 1982, 3, 4, transverse duct connector.
But there's an interesting story here because WELTY at the time was only doing the coil processing and notching. They did not do any roll forming. And
that was all being done at LOCKFORMER.
All being done at LOCKFORMER. And WELTY joined forces with George Lamberson at LOCKFORMER, Leo Gale engineering over there, and Bill Truska, head of sales. They joined together with QD Miskell at WELTY and had I don't know in terms of how it would finance, but actually WELTY could take an order for a new line and sell the LOCKFORMER part, and they bought it from LOCKFORMER, or LOCKFORMER can do it themselves too. But it was a joint effort between LOCKFORMER's roll forming ability and WELTY's coil processing, and they merged that together, which was the first really significant line, again, 1970, 71. But the insulation that came in 73, one of the biggest problems was adding insulation onto that. And that was an interesting story because they tried to join forces with LOCKFORMER again to do the Insulmatic, what became the Insulmatic, and LOCKFORMER backed out of it because George Lamberson was afraid of selling a machine that used solvent-based adhesives and a fire problem on the line, and backed out of it, dumped it back into WELTY, and Roger WELTY went out and visited a contractor in Murfreesboro, Tennessee that had actually developed that machine, because I had seen it in 1970 and told Roger, you ought to get down and take a look at this. And he bought the rights of the machine, and it basically has not much changed since. But that's how that whole thing came together. And then really not much between maybe the mid-70s until really TDC after that.
Yeah, the mid-80s was game-changing, for two reasons, from what I understand. One was the rolled-on flange, the TDC, TDF connector. But I think the more industry-changing, revolutionary tool was the plasma cutter.
Absolutely.
And that changed the entire industry for a lot of reasons. Automation was one, craft was another. It started to take craft out of the industry because it did everything for you as far as downloading and cut sheets and numeric designs, things of that nature. So
and when you say craft, you're talking about the actual snipping of the metal and that trade skill.
Yeah, being able to lay out a fitting. If you find somebody today that can do that, he's retired.
Yeah, no, I was talking, I don't remember who it was. I had a guy in the lobby at the factory in Iowa, and there's, a bunch of different fittings in the lobby there, and they were talking about that, this doesn't look that complicated. And I'm like, well, if you unfolded this, you would not recognize what you were looking at.
Yeah, so when you travel the shops, you see patterns.
And they're all the shape is a difficult to draw and a difficult to scribe out shape and cut. It takes a lot of skill.
There's a lot of geometry.
And there's a lot of geometry involved in that.
Yeah.
So when we talked about in a previous podcast, I think we discussed about the stickers. The stickers were putting some of that knowledge and the information right there that could hand to the guy in the shop in order to make that thing. And then now talking about the plasma table in the 80s, it then cut, instead of just giving you a sticker, it actually cut the shape right out of the steel. Correct. Is that right?
Correct. From a download, from a cam.
Yeah, not to belabor this, but the 80s, if you look back on the past 50 years, was definitely the decade. You had the first slide on and then TDC for your joint connections. Then you added the plasma cutting tables. You actually, another very big significant was the development of water-based adhesives. It was all solvent-based at the time, which had environmental issues, fire problems in a line, and then it went to water-based. And then the last thing was, the introduction of the computerized CAM/CAD systems. So those were 4 huge events that changed this industry.
Yeah, and I think that created some issues too with architects and engineers when it came to rolled-on flange versus slip-on flange. There was a lot of arguments, you can say, between building owners and architects as which one to specify and use. And SMACNA decided to make a choice on that in 1995 and implemented the rolled-on flange into the DCS, which also implemented tie rod construction for mid-panel, in-panel reinforcement, which cleaned everything up. It really did from a duct construction.
So what were they connecting the duct with prior to that?
Would be slip-on flange, could be duct-mate.
Like a duct-mate
or TDC, TDF, rolled form flange. So that was the constant battle, which one was going to be spec'd and which one was better and which one was going to be used. And owners and architects and building owners, they all argued about it. And I think the story I heard, SMACNA finally had to make a decision, and they made that decision to go with the LOCKFORMER TDC, roll form flange, and mid-panel, in-panel tie rod construction.
Now, has the design of that flange changed much since then, or has that pretty much stayed the same?
The functional criteria is the same.
Okay.
We still use the same data as far as specifications that we tested with back in 85, I would think, something like that.
Yeah. If somebody had told me when I first started in this industry, if you look at the original, the first SMACNA manual, DCS manual I'd have is 75. And if you look at the number of what they call T connections or transverse connections, it's 7 or 8 of them. And if you'd have told me today, around the world, there's one connection, 35 millimeter flange, I would never have believed that, never. But there was a war for very selfish reasons between the use of a slide-on, which were proprietary products, and TDC, TDF, which was basically a contractor fab product. This gets into a much deeper story, but you're right, it became a problem because specifications weren't in the SMACNA duct construction standards, and SMACNA has had a history of not approving proprietary products. So the work around that was to go out and test their own, it happened to be a TDC, but to test the rolled-on flange and then re-rating them as their own joint, and that solved the problem, just completely solved it.
Interesting.
And then we got into the 2000s, and now we're talking about water jets cutting insulation. We're talking about coil lines are highly automated. Just a lot more innovation in the 2000s, up to date to 2022. You know, when I look at it, and I'm proud to be associated with it, this company has been part of that innovation, or the innovation world for duct fabrication since 1938, and they just never stopped.
Yeah. And
they had some problems. They had issues, right? But it just never really stopped them. And so I'm proud to have that kind of team that's still thinking and innovative. Dave's been a big part of that as well. There's more to come, right? So we always look at it. We have to continue to innovate. We have to continue to bring new products to the industry for us to be viable, right? To be sustainable.
Yeah, the development of the corner machines in the 90s saved a lot of time. But if Mike's right, I can only think of maybe one product that was not really in my 50-year, going back to the Shopmaster was an angled product, but that's now part of the Mestek Group. But if you look at the Mestek Group today, I can only think of one product that was not of any significance that was not developed by this company and the individual brands up to today.
Yeah, it's a definitely a broad family.
Yeah.
With a single focus.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. I mean, if you look at the development of the cam side, it started out with a scribing machine from CTI, morphed into a plasma cutting, and the technology for laser at that time was not compatible with our industry. And it wasn't to the addition of the fiber laser, which again, LOCKFORMER picked up and brought the first viable laser machine. There are other what they call lights out lasers that some contractors use, but the ability to coil feed a laser table was a huge game changer. It's just recent, very recent.
Yeah, I think that segues to another podcast we'll talk about in the future, is some of that technology when it comes to water jet cutting for insulation only, and then now the fiber laser for HVAC duct manufacturing. It's quite neat to see how it's all evolved.
That sounds interesting. I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah.
Well, that looks like a good place to stop for today. On behalf of Mike Bailey and David Daw, I'm John Welty, and thank you for joining us for Shop Talk with Mestek Machinery. So hopefully our discussion on the innovations in the HVAC duct and fittings fabrication industry has been helpful to you. As you can see, we've been involved in a lot of them, and we continue to innovate as the industry continues to evolve. And as your operational needs change, please don't hesitate to reach out for a consultation. The best place to do so is at our website at mestekmachinery.com. There's absolutely no obligation. We'd love to hear from you and understand what you're looking to do and see how we can help you achieve your objectives. For now, thanks for listening. On behalf of Mike Bailey and David Daw, I'm John Welty. Join us again for the next episode of Shop Talk with Mestek Machinery.